All right, let's get started. Once again, thank you for joining us today. My name is Will Penfield, and on behalf of Everbridge, I'm excited to present this webinar, Revisiting Duty of Care for a Mobile Workforce. During the event, Stephen Crimando, Principal of Behavioral Science Applications, will discuss duty of care for the new mobile workforce, along with employer and employee guidance for safety in this new mobile world. Following Steve, Michael Matonis of Everbridge will cover an overview of our new product safety connection, which allows you to protect your employees anywhere, anytime. After the presentation, we will have a short Q&A session with our speakers. We encourage everyone to participate and ask questions during the webinar. You can submit your questions by typing in the questions widget and submitting it to all panelists. Links to the slides and a recording of the webinar will be sent out to all registrants by the end of the week. You can also look for a link to recordings for all of our webinars on everbridge.com under our resources section. And now I'd like to introduce you to our speakers. First up, we have Stephen Crimando, who is the Principal of Behavioral Science Applications, a training and consulting firm focused on human factors in crisis prevention and response. Mr. Crimando is a board-certified expert in traumatic stress, a certified trauma specialist, and holds Level 5 certification in Homeland Security. He's a diplomat of both the American Academy for Experts in Traumatic Stress and National Center for Crisis Management. He serves as a consultant and trainer for many multinational corporations, government agencies, major city police departments, and military programs. Over the past 2 decades, Mr. Crimando and his team have trained more than 20,000 mobile workers in personal safety and security. With more than 30 years experience as a frontline crisis responder, Mr. Crimando was deployed to both 9/11 and the 1993 World Trade Center attacks, coordinated on-site psychological operations at New Jersey's Anthrax Screening Center, and several international kidnappings and other acts of terrorism. He has published many articles in professional journals and magazines, as well as several book chapters, and is frequently called upon by the media and the courts regarding behavioral aspects of major crisis events. Following Steve, we will hear from Michael Matonis, who is the Sales Engineering Manager of the East at Everbridge, and he will provide the overview of Everbridge Safety Connection. And now, without further ado, I'd like to pass it over to Steve. Steve, you may begin.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you everyone for joining us today. This concept of the mobile workforce and really our duty of care to protect our workers out in the field honestly could not be a more timely and important issue for all of us on the call today. And I would like to draw your attention to the subtitle of the presentation, this idea that out of sight cannot mean out of mind. The workers who are, however we describe them, working from home, remote workers, telecommuters, workers in the field, lone workers, there's a lot of different ways we refer to folks who are not in our traditional office environments. That number is at a very, very high level, and it is growing. If we take a snapshot, for example, in 2015, as done by the Gallup poll, at that time they looked at 37% of American workers saying that telecommuting was part of their mix, whether it was almost full-time or part-time, that they were working from someplace else other than the office. This was a growing trend, and people were saying that they did so at least a few times a week. You know, we've got a whole new phenomenon, a whole new generation of workers who see the local coffee shop as a potential place of doing their work, of being in office. So when we look at safety and security, very often our vision organizationally as, you know, it's within our walls, it's to the extent of our the perimeter of our parking lots, it's in these different places that we can see, but once an employee is off-site, you know, how does that change? What do we owe that worker in terms of a duty of care, in terms of our responsibility for looking after their safety and security when they're working in all of these different places and all of these different ways? Now, this is actually even a little more interesting when we look at this study published recently by IDC, telling us that by 2020, folks, that's 3 years, right? 3 years from now, the projection is nearly 3/4 of the U.S. workforce will be working in these remote ways. We'll be working from the field, will be those kind of lone workers, remote workers working from home offices. That's the bulk of our workforce now. So the question throughout our program today is, how do your current models and methods of addressing safety and security, of worker wellness and well-being, how do they begin to extend beyond the physical walls of your castle? How do they extend to the worker who is anywhere, who is in their home office, who is in the coffee shop, who is working from the front seat of their vehicle, who can be in all of these remote locations? Well, if you're really not at a place yet where you've thought that through very fully, folks, the invitation is, kind of now's the time, because these 36 months between now and 2020, they're going to go fast, and we're looking at those numbers just ticking upwards. Now, of course, technology has driven a lot of that, right? With our mobile handheld devices, with all of our broadband access, all the different ways technology have enabled that, we have this very large and growing pool of employees who, as I said, are mobile. They're dispersed, meaning essentially they're all over the place at any given time, and they're traveling on our behalf. Travel can mean a few different things. For today's discussion, we'll probably, the only category we're not going to go deeply into is probably expats. We're probably not going to spend a lot of time on an employee who is kind of relocated to a workstation abroad. But we will talk a little bit about business travelers in this mix, and that business traveler obviously can be going across the country or outside the country, or simply, across the state or across town. Now, obviously, some sectors and some industries use mobile workers and a mobile workforce at much higher rates, and some sort of jobs where they really don't lend themselves to mobile work very, very much at all. But in those industries in which mobile work is a big part of the daily routine, there's a growing number of kind of best practices and regs that are specific to the industry. So on top of what I share with you today, and on top of what we share throughout the whole program, you do need to go back and think about, is there anything else that's specific to our line of business or businesses that really is above and beyond what I'm addressing here, or what's kind of covered under the general discussion of duty to care. So as we think about that, do hold on to the idea that you're probably going to have to drill down a little further into your unique sector and think about if there's anything that's particularly different. And I have to tell you, one that jumps to mind, and this is important, I'm going to talk about this a little more fully in just a few moments, but at the moment, and in the actual days right before the change of the federal administration, OSHA was working hard to push through a law, actual law for the first time, addressing workplace violence, and it was specifically written around healthcare, human services, and social services. And what we know is in that sector, employees are much more likely to be assaulted, much more likely to be hurt on the job through violence. And so with that in mind, OSHA was looking at that sector as a real priority. And just to kind of finish up that discussion, a lot of OSHA's investigations, citations, and fines over the last 5 years or so have been very much in that sector, knowing the risk profile is higher. So all of that is simply to say that depending on your industry and your line of work, there may be existing or evolving sorts of regulations and maybe even laws that you need to think about. The other part of that discussion, folks, is if you really are a multinational organization, or you're tuned into this webinar from really anywhere around the world today, you just have to hold on to the idea that the laws around mobile work and the duty of care to mobile workers actually does change as we cross those international borders. And there's some countries, we'll mention a few of those in a moment, in which laws and regulations are much stronger in terms of the protection of mobile workers. So you're going to have to do a little extra homework, but we're going to start with some operating assumptions, and essentially that means that wherever that worker is, and literally, I mean, it's a home office, it's a coffee shop, it's at a temporary location, we have to, one, understand the unique risks in those environments and start to think about countermeasures specific to those environments as well. Now, I know that kind of probably makes just really good common sense, right? But what a lot of organizations do, and I find this out sometimes the hard way. You know, when Will did the introduction, he said, you know, Steve's got this background as a trauma psychologist as well. And a lot of our work, unfortunately, is after some sort of accident or some type of assault to a worker. And organizations very often say to us, well, we have these really robust and really good policies, plans, procedures, and we've even done some exercises and drills around violence risks or other types of safety risks, but we've done those essentially just back at the mothership. We've done those just at corporate headquarters or other bricks and mortar locations, and really we've never thought that deeply about, you know, how do those things we have in place for workers in those more permanent locations, how do they actually help, if they do at all, how do they help someone who's out on the road? You know, so at a bottom line sort of way, that mobile worker, they have to have the exact same level of protection. It may actually mean different types of protections in terms of policies, plans, procedures, all of that, technologies, but they can't be at any greater risk than other employees. So back to the cover slide of, you know, out of sight can't mean out of mind. Just because we're not seeing that person on a day-to-day basis, or they may very seldom see them, you know, except for meetings or visits to them out in the field, they have to have the same sort of mindset about safety. They have to have the same sort of coverage under our policies. And we do have to think about the unique risks they face and develop, you know, countermeasures, because it always comes back, folks, always comes back to this idea about foreseeability, right? So myself, and I know you in the audience, we're always thinking about safety, we're thinking about security, and you need to be thinking about the defensibility of your actions. You know, why didn't we do something specific if we have workers in this position? So, you know, I'm introducing concepts to you today. You're going to, as I said, have to drill down a little more and think about what does it mean to different types of mobile workers, not just mobile workers as a class. Now, if we were looking at mobile workers as a type or a class, we can lump them roughly into a few categories, and increasingly common is home-based working, where the person primarily uses an office in the home. Now, this is an area where OSHA actually is a little bit fuzzy, and I'll talk about that in just a moment, but they've actually had some regulations over the year and some opinions over the years that can seem a little bit contradictory. But essentially, when we get down to that in a few moments, you'll see that OSHA uses the term at work, on the job, you know, on duty. They use all of those terms interchangeably, synonymously. So the home-based worker, you know, it's a fine line in terms of, well, it's their home. Do we go visit and check out the office? There's issues of privacy and such, but it's an office. And someone who's sitting in that home, they're doing work on your behalf. And you know what? In certain circumstances, there could be a number of different risks. And it's funny because a lot of organizations, especially OSHA, primarily thought about risks like ergonomics, like the sort of desk the home worker or the chair the home worker is sitting in. So I have to tell you, I've recently done a lot of work on the area of workplace violence for home office workers. And the more you dig into it, the more you recognize there's a number of safety and security risks for people in those homes. And that home worker, they may come into your office, the main office, for meetings and conferences and things of that nature, but primarily they're working from the home. There's a mobile worker who doesn't necessarily have a primary, you know, a home base. They're working essentially from their vehicle, right? So they're They're working in different offices. They're going to visit clients. They're working in field settings in some instances. They may sometimes be working from the comfort of their home. They may actually be in your office on occasion. But they're much more mobile. And when we talk about trackability, accountability, and the importance of those folks being able to reach us during an emergency, it becomes really important to us because these folks, regardless of what category we're talking about, man, they're on their own. When something goes wrong, these folks have to know how to handle it and how to call for help and get you involved as quickly as possible because literally, you know, to take that movie and the line from the classic movies, you know, no one would hear you scream. You may be in a place where you're so remote. And that's certainly the case in field work. And I tell you what, we've worked with organizations in which field work is someone out on an oil field, or it's a farmer, or someone in forestry or logging, or working on a power line and other sort of critical infrastructure. So field work can be literally all over the map. And there are people who work with hybrid models in which there are times of the year, the month, the week where they're doing their work a little more in one of these manners than the other. But the bottom line is when we think about duty of care, our duty of care is consistent and it's constant regardless of where that person is. If they're on the clock, we have that level of responsibility. Some mobile workers are working in pairs and teams. Some are working absolutely on their own. And as I said, when we think about things like agriculture and infrastructure, people may be literally, you know, in wilderness sorts of settings. But regardless of where they are, we need to think about, you know, the very basics. Do we have them covered? Do they know what to do? Is there a communication link in both directions that lets us kind of reach out to them and know where they are, and can they reach out to us in a crisis should something go bad? And of course that crisis, it could be anything from this is someone having chest pain to someone who encounters a hostile individual to a broken down vehicle. So mobile workers, as I said, are in every kind of field to some degree. And we mentioned this idea of different risks, and one I've worked with often over the years is with our pharmaceutical sector and our life science sector, in which we may have sales reps who are out making visits to doctors' offices, and guess what? They're carrying samples of medications in their briefcases, in their tote bags and such. And yeah, guess what, man? In a certain part of our population, there are people who are really, really desperate to get their hands on those kind of medications, and that changes the risk profile. So regardless of the exact nature of the work, we have, you know, we've established pretty well this big and growing population of mobile workers and just almost every imaginable setting that they can be in. Now that makes it difficult from a very simple planning standpoint to say, okay then, if we have this big mobile workforce, this is the thing you do. So I'm going to lay out for you what is a roadmap for addressing the duty of care, addressing safety and security issues, and then, as I said, kind of the heavy lifting, well, that belongs to you, to dig in a little deeper and say, what does this mean to our company and to our employees? And they may go in a number of different ways. So roughly our program today is going to be going in two directions, you know, one before the other. We're going to talk a little bit about the employer's perspective. You know, what are their legal duties, moral, ethical duties? How do we kind of do risk assessment? What is the appropriate way to do training and supervision in support of a mobile workforce? But you know what? When we talk about duty of care, it is a shared responsibility. You know, this is something we do with the employee. It's not something we do to the employee. And the message to the employee is that, you know, they can never be a passive observer to their own safety and security. They have to be that active participant. So they play a role. You know, it is a shared obligation of duty of care. It is not just one-sided on the employer's side. The employee has to hold up their end of that deal as well. So let's start there and talk, you know, about the employer's perspective. And that's really going to be the larger part of our discussion. And then we'll get down to some more kind of, you know, do's and don'ts from the employee standpoint. as well. So I use this graphic and I use this term about, the umbrella. And we need to start just with a very simple kind of policy review or an audit of your policies and procedures. And when I mean we, I mean, you, or you with some sort of expert if necessary. But really to start and say, are they covered? Are our mobile workers, wherever they are, do our current safety, security, violence prevention, do all of our programs concerned with their safety and wellness, do they actually apply to those people out in the field? And how are we making that work? How are we ensuring that they're under that umbrella? We run into a negligence issue right away. And I tell you what, in the United States, because we do not have duty of care laws per se, most litigation that revolves around some sort of accident, injury, wrongful death of an employee is not usually referred to as a duty of care suit. It's usually referred to as a negligence suit. We didn't do something that we were perceived to have done or should have done. There was a bad outcome, and there was harm done in that way that needs to be compensated. So the big question in terms of safety, security, and defensibility is, do our current policies, procedures, or our umbrella, as I said, does it reach over, does it cover our mobile workers? And does the mobile worker know that? Do they get that? Do they understand what we're doing on their behalf from the organization standpoint? Do they know what their unique obligations are under this idea of duty of care? And how do we make those mesh? How do we make those kind of link up in a way that we don't create gaps, right? We don't have a place where someone falls through the crack and we say, oh man, I thought I was covered by my employer, and the employer says, wow, I thought the employee knew to do this or that. So we want this continuity. We want this consistency. And I tell you what, and I hate to keep bringing it back to the courtroom, but one of the very first things that you're going to see in a negligence sort of suit that revolves around duty of care, and as I said, a wrongful injury or death sort of case, is was there a double standard? Do we have one much higher level of care for employees who are sitting in our office than we do for people out in the field, people who are our mobile workers? So one, you just owe it to people to have that universal level of attention to this issue, but you can't create a situation, and this is what the last bullet here is about, you cannot create the kind of perception that there is one level of care for people in-house and one level of care for people who are out in the field, and somehow the people in the field are a secondary or a lesser concern. That situation is going to go badly for everyone. So back to my kind of, subtitle about out of sight cannot mean out of mind, really comes back to this idea that regardless of where the person is, we have the same level of responsibility, that we have to work again to bring both the organization and the employee up to speed on that, and in no way can the mobile worker be at greater risk than other employees in the organization. Now, you may look at that statement and say, well, Steve, they are, because they're going out to the oil field or they're going into someone's home for a home health care visit, so their risks are different. And I get that, but it means that we've done some sort of job hazard analysis or some sort of risk assessment specific to their role and specific to their task, and where we've identified those foreseeable risks, we've taken reasonable steps. And those are two key words embedded in there, right? Foreseeability and reasonability. Foreseeable that we could have, and any other organization like ours could have seen the possibility of that kind of thing happening, and we did what was reasonable to help mitigate that, to help protect people against that kind of risk. So going back to this, as I said, at least in the States, duty of care is not a law, it's a legal concept. It talks in general ways about it being a legal, a moral, an ethical sort of obligation. And the best way in the States, the best way in the U.S., and I keep saying that in the States because, as I said, when we're in the U.K., when we're in Australia and New Zealand, when we're in a number of other countries, Canada, very strong as well, we actually have much tougher regs and in some instances laws that give us very clear guidance in terms of, are we in or out of of our lane in terms of duty of care. But here in the States, probably the very, very best way to align yourself and your organization with a duty of care is actually to think about the general duty clause, about OSHA's general duty clause. And that kind of is a tight enough fit that we start to cover all the important bases by applying the OSHA standard. Now, as I mentioned before, so I'm not going to spend a second on the slide, when we are in that courtroom environment, when we have had duty to care or duty of care legislation, in the U.S. at least, it typically shows up in the courtroom as negligence cases. And all basic sort of employment law revolves around, especially in this issue, about safety, talks about the duty employers have to provide a safe workplace, to identify risks, to mitigate those risks, and again, be looking after the workers' wellness. Now, I did say in some of my opening comments that there's a push in OSHA leadership right now to try to move forward in actual law specific to healthcare, social services, human services, and a lot of people may be thinking kind of where we are in the current moment. Well, the new presidential administration, they may come in, they may stop, they may undo that, but I will tell you, in those industries, healthcare and such, there's a lot of pressure from the unions and other organizations that seem like it probably will keep those efforts moving forward. And you may end up seeing some of the very first kind of workplace violence laws, at least, that start to look like real duty to care law in New Jersey. But as I said, most of this tends to fall under OSHA for us. When you're in the UK, interesting enough, and kind of a frightening sort of title to the law, the corporate manslaughter and corporate homicide acts here in the UK back to 2007 really very, very specifically addressed the duty of care for all kinds of safety issues, especially violence issues, for employees, whether they're on-site, mobile workers, or they're traveling. And when you really dig into that law, it actually does start to talk about, the expats as well and what kind of duty we owe to business travelers. So there are, again, if you are a multinational corporation today being represented, you actually have to think and reach out to your partners in those other locations in other countries and ask, tell us about what duty to care or duty of care means there. Are there specific laws? Are there different regs we should know about? Because, man, you could end up on the wrong side of a situation like that pretty clearly simply by not knowing about that. So there's two essential parts of this for the employer to think about. And one is, the duty of care itself. What do we owe someone? And the other part is, fulfilling that. How do we discharge that? And very often that term, discharging our duty and fulfilling the duty, again, are used somewhat interchangeably when we're looking at this idea of negligence. So we're going to start digging in then a little bit into the employer side a little further and say, well, what does it mean then to fulfill our duty or to discharge our duty? What things should we do? What things must we do? How do we proactively create the right set of skills, of knowledge, of awareness for employees, and how do we create the systems? And systems here may be practices and policies, and it can be technologies. How do we know someone's safe? How do we know where we are? They are. How do we facilitate them getting in touch with us in a moment's notice if something goes wrong when they're in the field? All of those things are part of how we discharge our duty when it comes to this sort of issues for the field. Duty of care, you also have to imagine, is a very wide net, and depending on the circumstance, if you have an employee traveling, that duty of care may extend to family they've brought with them. If you have business travelers overseas, and especially expats, some of the duty of care concepts, they actually extend to people's free time and their kind of leisure time, and if they're out sightseeing on their day off and such. So you really need to get down with your legal, with external legal sorts of experts where you can, and look at your existing policies, plans, procedures, and even exercises around safety, security, violence prevention, and think about how wide of a net does that cast, and go back to that concept I mentioned of the umbrella, you know, and are people really covered underneath that as well. Every executive in your organization needs to take this to heart, right? This is something that every stakeholder, and I mean that right down to the employee themselves, but certainly up to the C-suite, everybody needs to have a piece of this pie. Everyone needs to be thinking about what is my role in HR, what's my role in legal, in ops and security, to help fulfill our duty of care. And obviously, you're going to need a high level of management buy-in to help mobilize the resources and create the policies you need to do this well. Now, interesting, just to turn a corner, you know, I talked just a moment about the duty to care concept. I've mentioned OSHA. We're going to talk a little about more OSHA in just a moment. But workers' comp. From a workers' comp standpoint, there is a long list of cases at this point in which workers' compensation courts, different hearings, proceedings and such, tend to side with the employee if they're injured in the field while conducting mobile work. And that's falling ill, that's being injured, that's being assaulted as a direct result of their work. And I give you the example. It's a very simplistic example. If I'm a pizza delivery guy, I show up on your doorstep to deliver a pizza, we get in a scuffle, I get punched in the nose. That is workplace violence. That is under this umbrella. I didn't have another reason to be at your doorstep. I was on the clock. I was doing, you know, I was doing the company's work. When we have any of those injuries to people, whether it's from illness or assault or anything else, workers' compensation courts have very, very strongly sided with the employee. And we need to understand that as well. Now, OSHA, again, I did mention earlier, when we look at the general duty clause, which is a very good anchor for understanding of this issue, we want to understand that this is, you know, it's very broad, and OSHA created the general duty clause to be overly broad. It is the idea that workplace, on the job, on duty are synonymous terms, whether it's permanent or temporary. If someone is on the clock, they're under our umbrella in terms of our duty of care and our general duty under OSHA. And as I said, this hinges around those ideas of foreseeability, you know, not a black swan sort of event that was totally out of the blue and no employer could have possibly foreseen that thing happening. But when these risks are foreseeable, you know, we have, again, that need to do what's reasonable to help reduce or prevent that risk. So if you are thinking about, you know, how do I, in the U.S. at least, how do I fulfill our duty to care? How do I discharge that duty? One of the ways, as I mentioned, to do that well is to kind of use the general duty clause as the best practice, and then also be very aware as you see new and evolving regulations out of OSHA, maybe even laws, as I said, emerging in different sectors, and consider, you know, how they would apply to your sector as well. So a few things to think about that are kind of like our risk indicators as you're looking at your situation, you know, is, you know, does the policy that we have, is it broad enough, or in some way do we specifically discuss mobile workers? Or if I were to read this policy as someone outside your organization and just don't see where mobile workers fit into your thinking, obviously you've created, you know, a degree of risk for yourself. Another risk indicator is, especially with business travelers and especially with field workers, is if you're treating senior management different than other employees and you're creating that kind of double standard, this person, when they travel, man, they're staying in much more secure locations, and maybe our very high-level executives have personal protection. And I'm not encouraging, well, every mobile worker needs, a bodyguard. That's not where we're going with this. But the idea is that at the basic level, we're providing the same level of care to anyone who's out there on our behalf. If we fail to educate the employee, if we fail to create the, not just the knowledge, skills, and awareness, but give them the tools. And as I said, some of those are skill-based and some are technologies. If we don't document that, if we don't create a system of capturing that, and the last bullet point's important here, and that's the idea that we're considering the employee's risk door to door. When they walk out the door and they're mobile, when they get to a location, when they're working at a location, we need to envision things like their commute, their travel, if they're on the clock. If you're a field worker and you're going out to the oil field, what's our risk in transit, as well as being on the ground, boots on the ground. So these are places, you need to look at policies and procedures and say, can I check these boxes off in good faith? Are we creating that wide enough umbrella? And when we look at this as a program, how do I create a mobile worker, violence prevention or safety and security program, however you want to phrase it. And folks, think about it. Now is really the time to be doing that if you're not there already. If you look at the statistics that we started with, 3/4 of our workforce will be mobile by the year 2020. These are the basic steps, creating that top-level buy-in and ownership, creating policy and procedures that will hold water, both in terms of their practice and in litigation, and then creating the resources. And those resources may include systems, as I said, technologies and communication, training, and believe it or not, more training. So the question becomes, did you prepare this employee for the risks in the field? Yeah, during orientation, we spent 10 minutes talking about that, and they got that once, when they were hired 10 years ago. The risk profile in the community may have changed dramatically in that 10 years, just the risk profile in our society as well. And then you think about, of course, with any kind of program maintenance and ongoing updates for that as well. So the elements essentially are policy, their risk assessment, training, accountability, and that kind of emergency capability where people can get a hold of us in a crisis, and then all the general support for the mobile worker when they're out in the field. So you see here, and remember, you have access to these slides, and they'll be archived for you to go back to after the program today. Dig into some of these finer points about what policy looks like. It acknowledges the risk. It talks specifically to what it means to a mobile worker. It makes a statement of how the employer will address these. It discusses it as a shared obligation. And you have to make sure it integrates back to all your other existing safety, security, and violence prevention policies and plans. So we're not creating this, as I said, as a separate class. In policy, probably has some general statements, and there may be some other areas like communication that once you get to the procedural level need to be spelled out very clearly, like the way we're going to ensure your safety is we're going to have you check in a few times throughout the day, or we're going to reach out and trace you in different ways, that we know how you've gotten home or back to your home base safely, and how do we employ kind of our newest technologies and newest products around that as well. Part of this, again, goes to job hazard analysis. Do we really know what that worker's risks are? And that probably means, two things. One is going to find out, going out and working and training and looking. The other is asking them and getting the employee to be one of your subject matter experts and helping to identify. And I mean, look at some of these risks. We're talking about, am I, not just the nature of the work, but what time of day am I doing it? Is it dark out? Am I in a place where I'm off the cell phone grid? Are there other kind of hazards in that environment? So you really do need to look at job hazard analysis, and flowing from that, then we design the training. Because if we say, here's the risks, then here's the competencies you need to mitigate the risks, and then we provide the training to help build those competencies. A lot of times organizations will reach out to myself or someone like myself and say, Steve, we need training for our mobile workforce in safety, security, and all these issues. And we'll say, well, yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and tell me about your policies, your plans, your procedures, your technologies first. Well, we don't have any of those yet. Well, the purpose of the training is to introduce that to folks and make sure they know how to use all those elements. So training is later in the series, but you have to make sure all that other homework is done first. And training may be about just the nature of mobile work, the possible safety risks they face, what to do to reduce the risks, how to report, whether on an emergency basis or after the fact, how to call for help, but really to tighten that loop so we're always in dialogue. And then depending on their risk, say, for example, if violence is one of the higher risks, well, then we may need to do some very specific sorts of verbal de-escalation training and things of that nature. If medical emergencies are a risk, do they have what they need? If I'm sending people into an area where I know there's likely to be civil unrest, have I given them some basic instruction on how to keep them safe? And supervision. And really the only thing I can mention here, two things that are important to share, is the legal concept of negligent supervision, where we should have been providing, right, ongoing supervision to that person. And if we were, we would have known more about these risks. But the top bullet here is the most important. It remains an employer's duty to supervise even if constant supervision is not possible, even if you're not seeing this person every day or even that frequently. We have to devise ways of providing ongoing and consistent supervision. And on the job accountability, knowing where they are, knowing that they're all right, and as I said, knowing that if there is an emergency, they can quickly reach out to help. Let us know, mobilize the right sort of resources for solving that crisis, because it comes back to the idea that many mobile workers literally are out there on their own in the physical sense, but in terms of the company's responsibility, they can't be out of sight, out of mind. They can't be left alone. And of course, ongoing support during a crisis, after a crisis, in terms of medical care, EAP, crime victim services, if that's been the nature of the event, documenting this well, doing our after-actions reports, and creating ways forward to change that. Obviously, on the EAP side, just because an employee is off-site or a field worker, they need to be privy to and have access to those same levels of emotional support should they have encountered an adverse event or a dangerous event out in the field. And in our last few minutes together, before we switch over and start to talk more about, Everbridge's really kind of important products and so integral to our concepts here, how do we connect during the crisis? Let's talk just for a few moments about the employee's role. And as I said, at a general level, it's a shared obligation. And one of the most important parts is the employee knows the plan policy, has gone through the right kind of training, that they're maintaining a high level of situational awareness, that they understand that if something looks wrong, feels wrong, to get themselves out of that situation and reach out for help, and to also be giving us feedback so as an organization you could learn if something's not working well out in the field or new risks are emerging, that we as an organization, and you as an organization, can make those changes. Beyond that, they have to be prudent themselves in their behavior. They can't be taking exceptional risks. If there's we're in a time of year right now with a lot of storms across the country. See, in transit, high water in the road, that we've all learned in emergency management. It's very difficult to tell how deep that is, and swift water can take your vehicle and you're gone in a minute. So we can encounter, these sort of things, but we also have to count to some degree on the employee being reasonable. And also, as I said, reporting when they've had accidents and near misses so we can continue to learn. So two general tests that we apply when we're looking at our mobile workers in terms of safety and security are these kind of questions. Do you spend a lot of time working from your vehicle? Do you spend a lot of time sitting alone in your vehicle, kind of working on a tablet or a laptop? You spend a lot of time going back and forth to places where you may be carrying expensive or desirable equipment, and I spoke about the pharmaceutical rep, things like that. Are our locations isolated? Are we there in the dark? What are those dynamics like? So there's some questions we want to kind of ask to look at the employee's perspective. Let them think themselves in terms of self-assessment. Am I being vigilant? Am I looking for those kind of warning signs that tell me something's amiss and maybe I should trust my gut feeling and back out of this situation? As I said, does the employee know the employer's policies? Are they always thinking about a plan B? The thing about this, especially with home workers, if you think about the person working in a home office, the risk, one of the greatest risks is just complacency. You're literally in the comfort of your own home, and it's very hard to imagine something, terrible going on. A whole nother discussion, but we can talk about both robberies and home invasions. We could talk about other more classic types of workplace violence that happen to home workers as well. But the bottom line is here, does the employee know how to report, and do they know how to reach out for assistance wherever they are if something goes wrong? So we want to make sure they have the toolkit, they have the phone, the tablet, the technology, but the right applications, the right kind of solutions that we're discussing today to enable them to stay in contact and to reach out for emergency assistance. Are they armed with knowledge about our policies, our practices? Are they armed with training about situational awareness? What am I looking for? Teaching them the basics of how to look for anomalies, both kinds, positive and negative. Positive anomalies are things that are in the environment that shouldn't be there, and negative anomalies are things that should be in the environment, but they're not. Both of those are indicators for us that something's different and maybe something's wrong. Depending on if they have what kind of contact they have, maybe basic verbal de-escalation skills, and of course, relying on their just good gut instincts. So we build around that employee policy, procedures, a mindset of preparedness, a high level of situational awareness, and then those other systems, 24/7 support, the technologies to get a hold of us in a crisis, confidence and knowledge that they know what to do, and also know that they have executive and administrative permission that if something looks wrong or feels wrong, to get themselves out of that and not put themselves at risk. So when we think about communications, I know I'm preaching to the choir here, folks. One of our key concepts, of course, is redundancy, that we need systems that could both push out and let the worker who's in an emergency push out, in different channels, different ways, critical messages. We understand that communications can be tough for field workers during during different sorts of emergencies and disasters when power's out and maybe cellular is temporarily interrupted, all of that as well. So I know that I'm speaking to an audience who always has Plan B and Plan C in mind. So multiple forms of communication, multiple forms of messaging, and we'll sum it up and move on to a review of the product then. All organizations have a duty of care. It doesn't matter what kind of organization you are, your profit, your non-for-profit, regardless of what sector, and you owe the same level of care to employees who are on-site as off-site, wherever they may be working. You, the employer, has to demonstrate that. You have to demonstrate that by aligning yourself with best practices, with OSHA's duty of care, with understanding how you get the employer and the employee both involved in this duty of care issue. And you want to make sure you're having this discussion with all the smart people in your organization, from HR and legal and security and all the people in the C-suite who need to buy into this. Given where we started, huge and growing mobile workforce, now is the time to start developing an effective duty of care program and to start making sure you have the right tools. That's my story. I'm sticking to it. I wish you, your organization, and your mobile workers a lot of luck and a lot of safety and health in doing their job. And Will, I'll pass it back over to you, sir, to take the lead.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. And this is actually Michael Matonis at this point. So Thank you for that presentation. It was very informative, and I'm sure everyone got a lot out of it. So, but let's look at how we at Everbridge can help with some of the concepts that Steve addressed there during his presentation. So, we look at sort of the different challenges that we have. Obviously, one of the ones that Steve mentioned was that, we are looking at an increasingly mobile workforce. We have folks who are not sitting at their desks to get alerts or to have their desk phones ring. We are looking at, being able to locate our employees, not just the static locations, where I might be assigned, where's my office location, but also, where was I last? Where did I last badge into? What building was I in? And also, where am I expected to be? Am I traveling? Am I going to be in our Boston office or our LA office at any given time? As well as challenges increasing threats in traditionally safe locations. Okay, so some of the situations that we've seen, with something like Hurricane Sandy or the Orlando incidents in San Bernardino, et cetera, the ability to address those threats in those traditionally safe locations is something that is increasingly a challenge. Also, confirming our safety. Can we get to the impacted employees? Can we reach out to them in the event of a natural disaster or a shooting or a fire or a terrorist event? We have distributed teams, we have larger campuses, employee travel. All these things become challenges, challenges and express the need to extend the traditional emergency notification solution that we're familiar with. Okay, the methods of traditional emergency notification are going to allow us to get in touch with folks. The challenges are that how do we know where folks are at any given time? So in an example like this where in a critical event we've got maybe an active shooter in building A, I want to be able to send the appropriate message to each one of those different audiences. I want to tell building A that we've got an active shooter, seek shelter in a locked room, but at the same time, my folks that are in building C on the other side of my campus, I'm going to want to tell them that, hey, we're evacuating the building because there's a shooter across the campus. We want you to use the west stairs specifically so that you move away from the shooter event in this particular case. So safety connection is going to allow us to have some more location-based alerting during an incident response. All right, expand that duty of care so we can reach our traveling employees, as Steve indicated, but also try and evacuate, automate our evacuation mustering and improve our response overall during the course of an event. So as most of you know, Everbridge, we are a unified software platform, and we have built multiple applications on top of our platform, okay, on top of our rules engine, utilizing our APIs, utilizing our ability to reach different contacts in the system. And we really want to look at building those multiple applications to help our contacts, our clients, reach their constituents appropriately, okay? And what we're going to talk mostly about today is the safety connection piece, and that approach of assess, locate, automate, and communicate to our folks, okay? So assess, first off, what do we do? Well, how do we determine the severity of an event, okay? Or what's the incident at hand? Do we have integrations or feeds from different threat assessment type tools so that we can see if there's an event, see if there's something happening that might be affecting some of our folks? All right. Then, get our location data on our people from multiple sources. Have the ability to be mobile aware. Give folks the ability to check in from their mobile phones into the Everbridge system. Tell us where they are. Be access aware. Integrate with wireless access systems like Cisco or with badge systems like Linnell or Tyco S2. So that we know not just which building someone usually works in, but which building they've actually swiped into most recently. Right. Be travel aware through our partners like International SOS so that we can have folks' expected locations in the system so that we know that someone was expected to be flying to Paris if we are alerted to the fact that there's an event in Paris. Right. And even be room and schedule aware. So if we want to get very granular, integrate with systems like Dean Evans so that we can see who's on the invites in which conference rooms in our building so that we can really be very granular in terms of the folks that we are notifying in a given situation. All right, so again, moving from that actual location to the expected location based on the different types of feeds and different types of location data that we can pull in. So that allows us, after the assessment piece, that allows us to locate. How do we locate who's impacted for a given event? I can see who's assigned to a particular building. I can see how many people that's their static location, how many people that's their last known, how many people are expected to be there. And then we can look at notifying specifically those people by automating incident communication forms, such as an active shooter like this, where it's a simple form. We can make sure that we can access that form via the web or via our mobile applications, give us a set of standard operating procedures, escalation policies, collaboration, all those pieces, but make it easy so that we don't have to be thinking during the course of an incident. We can just pick and choose the right, pick the right template and send that out. And then lastly, communicate. Okay, how do we communicate to employees? As you well know, Everbridge is the leader in the communication space, so delivery to over 200 countries, to over 100 different types of devices. We sent just over 1 billion messages in 2015. I think we sent about 1.6 billion in 2017. And the ability to have our stakeholders employed or informed so that they can get messages that are initiated by security, but also be able to push out messages to our security teams from an SOS perspective from employee-initiated types of alerts. All right, so what can we do? Well, we can, what does it give us? It gives us the ability to ensure the safety of our employees, to expand that duty of care, and to improve our operational response. At that point, Will, I'll hand this back to you so we can open up the floor for some questions.
All right, thank you, Michael. We are going to move on to our Q&A portion of the event. As a reminder to attendees, you may submit your question, typing the question into the open text field and submitting it to all panelists. First up, we have a question for you, Steve. Much of the focus of this has been directed at sort of corporate entities. Do these same concepts apply to government agencies? And would the terms duty of care, negligent suits, and OSHA standards resonate with government?
Yeah, they do and they should. The government, in fact, is one of the sectors where we have some of the largest mobile workforces. Telecommuting is large and growing in the government sector, and these concepts apply to all levels of government, whether it's municipal, upstream to county, state, federal, and so forth. So the standards are what they are. They're fairly universal across, as I said, government and non-governmental, profit and non-profit as well.
All right, thank you. Next question we have for you. You talked about a door-to-door approach in your presentation. How does this differ for staff who work in the office versus the field?
I guess the differentiation is if the person is on the clock. So if I have a person who's working in the office and they're going out to a meeting, going out to a conference, going out to something that's a work-related function, I do have to anticipate, issues they may have while they're on the clock. Now, where it doesn't apply is obviously when the person's, before they punch in and after they punch out. It doesn't apply to their commute back and forth to work. The only exception of that tends to be when we look at kind of some of our business travelers and our international travelers, because their whole reason for being in a specific city is that they're there on our company's behalf. But for the most part, the simple test is, was the worker, when we think about this door-to-door concept, was the person on duty? Were they literally on the clock for us? And that may stretch because, they may have an after-hours event to go to or some sort of business function to go to that's in the evening and after traditional work hours, but they're still on the clock. So we do have to think, can they safely get back and forth? Is there any real foreseeable hazard? Some of the larger corporate entities, of course, not only have travel offices, but have travel risk offices as part of their security function. And they can get, very, very granular and do a lot of intelligence in terms of knowing what those risks are. That's certainly beyond many organizations. But we still, again, need to apply that general standard as, is the person on duty when we look at that question of door-to-door.
All right, thank you. Next question I have is for you, Michael. Are the safety connection capabilities from Everbridge available via a mobile application?
Well, safety connection is part of some of the safety connection functionality is available in our mobile application contact bridge, so that through the contact bridge application you have the ability to check into the system, you have the ability to initiate an SOS or set up a safe corridor. And then when you are initiating any of the templates via a mobile application, the ability to access folks from those that are giving us information from those types of check-ins is available through the templates.
All right, thank you. Last question here before you wrap up is for you, Steve. Do you have any recommendations for persuading directors and executives to sort of buy into this new duty of care for mobile workers and sort of the technology that can help protect mobile workers?
Without scare tactics, which usually people see through pretty clearly, one of the things that are helpful is doing kind of case scenarios. And one is either looking and seeing if there are cases that have been either in the news or gone through the courts, and raising that question of, how would this apply to us in our mobile workforce? The other is to do scenarios and say, we're thinking right now about how safety and security apply to our mobile workforce, and we've created these three kind of hypothetical scenarios. One's an employee working from home, one's an employee working in this other way, one more. And let's just kind of test those. Let's do those as a little bit as somewhat of a tabletop and have a discussion around, how a scenario would unfold and what our exposures are, both physically and legally around that. So the solution I've seen to that best is to try to take it from the abstract concept of, we have this duty to care to let's talk about what the realities are for our mobile workforce. Let's talk about some of the risks they are encountering or they foreseeably can encounter. And let's talk about what we have in place or don't have in place at the moment to cover that. So my advice would be to try to make it scenario-based to get buy-in as opposed to the more kind of legalistic or conceptual discussion.
All right, thank you. And with that, we have run out of time, so I want to thank Steve and Michael for a great webinar and all of our attendees who were able to join us today. As a reminder, you will receive an email with a link to the recording and the slides from today's event by the end of the week. And if you haven't already, please take a moment to follow us on Twitter @Everbridge and join our group on LinkedIn, Everbridge Incident Management and Emergency Notification Professionals. For those of you interested in requesting a demo of the Everbridge system, please visit everbridge.com/request-demo. Thank you all again for joining us today, and we hope to see you online again soon. Have a great day.